Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. No story had more lasting influence in Norse culture or beyond it than the Saga of the Volsungs. The Saga of the Volsungs is only the most cohesive form of the story of the Volsung family of heroes, which is related among other places in poems of the Poetic Edda and in artwork from the Viking Age and afterwards. But the Saga of the Volsungs being the most cohesive form, it is the form that has had the most influence on modern literature and which is most well known today. The Saga of the Volsungs has been recently translated by me and published together with its medieval fanfic sequel, the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, from Hackett Publishing Company, and that is widely available. Here I'm going to summarize the Saga of the Volsungs for those who may not be familiar with it or who may want to become refamiliarized with it. This story begins with a man named Siggi, who is a son of the god Odin. Siggi kills a slave named Brethi, who belongs to another man, and for that he is exiled from the kingdom where he once lived. But Odin helps him out by giving him a ship, and Siggi uses the ship, together with his Viking crew, to gain wealth and power anew, and he becomes king of a new kingdom in Hunland. The Norse have a distant memory of a fierce people known as the Huns, but not much memory about what they were like culturally. They tend to just make them kind of an early Norse people. Now, in Hunland, Siggi's son Rerir inherits the throne after Siggi dies, and Rerir and his wife find that they are unable to produce an heir. Rerir and his wife pray to the gods to allow them to have a child, and Odin and Frigg hear their prayer, and Odin decides to send a Valkyrie named Hljóð, in the form of a crow, to Rerir with an apple. The apple is dropped on Rerir's lap, and he seems to understand what this is for, so he eats it and then immediately goes to his wife, and they conceive a child. Unfortunately, while his wife is pregnant, Rerir dies, and his wife, after having been pregnant for 6 years, finally tires of the pregnancy and has the baby cut out of her. And so at 0/6 years old, the son Volsung emerges from his mother's womb, and as she dies, he kisses her and tells her that he will never flee from fire nor from iron. Volsung goes on to become a famous hero and king of Hunland himself, and marries Hljóð, the Valkyrie that brought his father the apple. Volsung and Hljóð have 10 children, an oldest pair of twins named Sigmund, a son, and Signy, a daughter, and then 8 more sons. Now, when Signy grows up, Volsung arranges for her to marry the king of Jötland, who is named Siggeir. Signy does not want to marry him, which is always a bad sign in the sagas. Anytime that a woman resists being married to the man that her father wants to marry her to, it's always going to end in disaster. Signy does not want to marry him, but Volsung insists, and so a wedding feast is thrown for Signy at the home of Volsung. Now, at this wedding feast, which occurs in Volsung's hall, which has in its center a tree called Barnstok, which is called both an oak tree and an apple tree in different chapters of the Saga of the Volsungs. This tree's name, Barnstok, literally could be read as child tree or perhaps family tree, and so it's interesting that during the wedding feast, a man that no one can recall seeing before, he's old with one eye, wide-brimmed hat, dressed all in gray, with a staff in his hand, walks in and sticks a sword into Barnstok, Volsung's family tree, and says that whoever can draw it from the tree receives it as a gift from him. Something a little bit like Excalibur. Well, all the men at the feast try to draw the sword out of the tree. Finally, no one can do it except for Sigmund, Volsung's oldest boy. Siggeir, the bridegroom, offers to buy the sword from Sigmund, but Sigmund won't sell it to him because he says that if it had been meant for Siggeir, he would have been able to draw it out of the tree. This angers Siggeir, but he buries his feelings and declares that he needs to leave the feast early, which is a little bit unconventional, but he promises Volsung that he will host a make-up feast for him in his own kingdom of Jötland some months later. He invites Volsung and his sons to come to that. And so Siggeir leaves with his daughter Signy. A few months later, the appointed time comes, and Volsung and his sons leave for Jötland to attend this feast. And they get there in the evening and stay in their own boat, but in the evening, Signy his daughter comes to Volsung and tells him that this is an ambush, that in the morning they are going to be attacked by Sigurd's army. Volsung tells her to go home to her husband. He tells her not to betray her husband's secrets, and he reminds her that he promised his mother when he was 6/0 years old that he would never flee from fire nor from iron. And besides, he says, what would the girls say about my boys if they knew that they had fled from battle? Now, sure enough, the next morning they are ambushed, and Volsung, after a hard battle, is killed. His sons are all captured, and Sigurd is preparing to just execute them when Signy, his wife, asks him to make their deaths slow. Of course, he thinks this is crazy. Why would she want her brothers to die more slowly and more terribly? But she says that the eye loves what it lingers on, and that she wants to look at her brothers a little bit longer. And so, Sigurd has them tied up in stocks, and each night his mother, who is a wolf apparently, the genetics in these stories rarely makes too much sense, his mother, the wolf, comes and eats one of them at midnight each night for 9 nights, till only Sigmund is left. Now, with only Sigmund left, Signy needs to do something to try to save at least him, and she comes up with the fairly obvious plan. She goes to a slave and she says, take this honey and cover Sigmund, my brother, with it, and don't forget to fill his mouth with it as well. So the slave goes out to Sigmund where he's bound up in the stocks, covers him in honey, and then fills his mouth with honey. Sigmund seems to understand the plan, and that night at midnight when the wolf comes to eat him, it notices the honey that covers him and starts licking it up. And when it's done licking all the honey off of him, he opens his mouth to reveal the honey within his mouth, and the wolf sticks her tongue into his mouth. At this point, Sigmund bites down into her tongue, and then as the wolf struggles to get free from him, it breaks open the stocks that he's bound to, and Sigmund kills the wolf. He will now spend the next many years living in the forest in Sigurd's realm in a turf house that he builds for himself, with Signy coming to him from time to time with supplies and news. Signy and Sigurd have 2 sons, and when the oldest one reaches the age of 10, Signy decides she's going to send him to Sigmund, her brother, to train up to be a warrior. Unfortunately, she's not too sure that this son is actually going to have warrior material in him, because she's been actually sewing his clothing into his sleeve and then ripping the clothing out, and the boy has cried when she's done this. This is a bad sign because, of course, this shows low pain tolerance on the part of the boy and willingness to do the very unmasculine act of weeping. Nonetheless, when he turns 10, she sends him to Sigmund to train up to be a warrior. He comes to Sigmund's turf house, and Sigmund says, oh hey, Signy's boy, why don't you make us some bread? Here is a bag of flour. I'm going to go out and get us some firewood while you do that. Sigmund goes out to gather some firewood, and while he's doing that, the boy opens up the flour bag, but does not make flour, as Sigmund discovers when he comes back. He says, what's going on? Why haven't you made bread as I requested? And the boy says, well, there's a poisonous snake inside this bag of flour. And of course, Sigmund's a little bit concerned. This shows the boy may not have the courage of a Volsung. And so the next time that he sees Signy, he tells Signy what's happened, and she tells him, just kill him. We don't need the kid then. So Sigmund kills that son. Before long, Signy's other son turns 10, and she will send him to Sigmund to train up as well. But the same thing will happen. Sigmund will give him a bag of flour to make bread while he's out gathering firewood. The boy will be too scared of the poisonous snake, and so Sigmund will kill him. Well, this puts Signy in a bad position because she wants her father and her brothers avenged, and she needs someone, a son of hers preferably, who can help her brother Sigmund achieve that vengeance. But clearly, Sigurd's genes aren't strong enough, even with her Volsung genes, to make a man of Volsung character. So who can she find, a father or son, who would be almost as good as another child of Volsung? Naturally, she hits on the notion that she needs to have a child with her brother Sigmund. Now, it so happens that a witch passes through Jutland soon after this, and Signy asks the witch if she will trade appearances with Signy. The witch agrees to do so and goes to bed with Sigurd, under the pretense that she is in fact Signy, his wife. While Signy, disguised as the witch, goes to the turf house where Sigmund lives and, pretending to be lost in the woods, asks if she can receive his hospitality for the night. She stays with him for 3 nights and receives more than his hospitality. They sleep in the same bed, and goes home, switches appearances with the witch again, and 9 months later gives birth to what we might expect to be a horrible mutant because he's the son of 2 siblings, but in fact is one of the great Norse heroes, Sinfjotli. Now, Sinfjotli, as he grows up, Signy treats him the same way, sewing his clothing to his skin and then ripping it out to see what his reaction will be. But when she does this to Sinfjotli, instead of crying, he says nothing and doesn't react at all. And so Signy asks him, well, doesn't this hurt a little bit? And Sinfjotli says, well, I don't think that Volsung would think much of such an injury. So of course she's impressed with this. This is the right reaction. When he turns 10, she sends him to Sigmund to train up to be a warrior. And when he comes to Sigmund, the same thing happens as with the other 2 kids. Sigmund says he's going to go out and get some firewood, and he asks Sinfjotli to stay and make bread with this bag of flour. Well, he comes home after his firewood gathering expedition and finds that Sinfjotli has made bread. There's a loaf of bread on the table. And so Sigmund says, well, didn't you find something else in the bag of flour with the flour? And Sinfjotli says, yes, there was a poisonous snake, but I just kneaded it in with the bread. And Sigmund laughs, ho ho ho, or of course this is Old Norse, hlo hlo hlo, and says, well, we can't eat that, that's a poisonous snake that you've ground down into the flour. But he's very impressed with the boy, and so he begins raising him up to be a warrior. And so they spend the next several years going through the woods, robbing and killing men. This is Viking culture after all, so our heroes can do this kind of thing. And eventually, after these many years of raiding and killing in the forest, they kill 2 princes who have wolf skins with them, and for some reason Sigmund and Sinfjotli put these on. And when they put them on, they turn into wolves. Well, Sigmund says this is a setback for the robbing part of our program, but not for the killing parts. Let's keep going with the killing. I'm going to split up, and I'm going to go my way, you go your way. And if one of us encounters more than 7 men on his own, howl for help from the other. By the way, the saga assures us that they can understand each other's howls and barks. They understand wolfish once they've turned into wolves. But we can each attack men in a group fewer than 7 on our own. Sigmund and Sinfjotli agree to this, and they split up. And at one point, Sigmund attacks 7 men, but he howls for help. Sinfjotli comes and helps him kill the men. But then a little bit later, Sinfjotli comes across 11 men, and he attacks them on his own without calling for help. He kills all of them, but he's badly injured, and then he howls for Sigmund. Sigmund comes and finds him badly injured and says, why didn't you call for help? And Sinfjotli says, well, I suppose I was more manly than you. You needed help with 7, I didn't need help with 11. Well, now Sigmund attacks him anew and nearly rips his throat out. But he soon regrets it and wonders what he can do to help Sinfjotli, when he notices 2 weasels fighting in the grass, one of which tears out the throat of the other and then runs into the woods and grabs a little leaf that he brings back to put on the wound of the other weasel to heal him. Having seen this, a similar leaf is then dropped nearby Sigmund by a raven, and Sigmund takes that leaf, puts it on Sinfjotli, and heals him. Not long after, they manage to escape their wolf forms, and Sigmund decides that it is now time to go and avenge Volsung and his brothers, and kill Sigurd. Sigmund and Sinfjotli arm up, and they go to Sigurd's hall. They hide outside among some ale barrels, while inside, Sigurd and Signy's 2 new, very young children are playing on the floor, rolling golden rings around like marbles. One of these rings rolls out of the hall, and so one of the little boys runs out chasing it, and finds 2 unfamiliar men in armor with weapons in hand. He runs back in and tells his parents what he's seen, which prompts Signy to pick up both of the little children and take them outside, knowing that it must be Sigmund and Sinfjotli, throw them at Sigmund's feet and tell him that his nephews have betrayed him and he needs to kill them. Sigmund says, I'm not going to kill your kids, but Sinfjotli says, I'll kill your kids, and kills them, and takes them in, throws them at the feet of Sigurd, and says, we're here to avenge Volsung and his sons. Well, Sigurd orders his men to attack them, There's a hard fight, but Sigmund and Sinfjotli are outnumbered, and they are captured. This time Sigurd decides he's going to decide how to kill them slowly, and he decides that he is going to bury them alive. So he has them buried alive in a deep pit with a huge boulder rolled over it. But while they're being buried, Signy throws a rack of ribs to Sinfjotli. And so Sinfjotli jokes to Sigmund, well, we won't be hungry. But as he starts to eat the ribs, he realizes there's something else inside of it, and it turns out to be the sword that Odin had willed to Sigmund in the tree Barnstalk at Signy's wedding. Using this sword, they're able to actually saw out through the huge boulder that pins them in. And so Sigmund and Sinfjotli, having escaped their would-be grave, go to Siggeir's hall, barricade everyone in, and burn it down that night. But as it's burning, Sigmund calls out to his sister Signy, asking her to spare her own life. She comes out and says that while she was unwillingly married to Siggeir, she will willingly die with him, even though she has spent her whole life trying to bring about his death and vengeance for her father and brothers. This always reminds me of Thanksgiving at my house. And then she tells Sigmund that Sinfjotli is actually his son, and she goes back into the flames and dies. Well, Sigmund and Sinfjotli will return to Hunland, where Sigmund will dethrone the pretender who had assumed the throne of his father after Volsung's death, and go on to become a great and famous king. Sigmund's first wife is named Borghild, with whom he has a son named Helgi, who is the subject of a couple of poems in the Poetic Edda, some of the action of which is repeated in the Saga of the Volsungs, but it's not very central to the story. Sinfjotli, for his part, falls in love with a woman who is also desired by the brother of Sigmund's wife, Borghild. He ends up killing Borghild's brother, and while Sigmund throws a funeral feast for Borghild's brother for his wife's sake, Sinfjotli attends, and of course Borghild wants her vengeance for her brother. So she mixes up some poison in a drinking horn and brings it to Sinfjotli and asks him to drink. Sinfjotli looks at this cloudy-looking liquid in the cup and is suspicious and asks his father to drink it instead because Sigmund is impervious to poison. Sigmund drinks it down, and a little bit later Borghild brings Sinfjotli another suspicious-looking drink. Sinfjotli again hands it over to Sigmund to drink instead. Well, as is so often the case in these stories, the third time is the charm. Sinfjotli is brought a third horn full of poisonous mead by Borghild, and she curses his courage for not drinking the first two, which means that he's pretty much compelled to drink the third one, especially after he turns to his father/uncle, Sigmund, and Sigmund simply says, "Loto gron sia," better wet that mustache. So Sinfjotli drinks it, and of course immediately falls dead. Sigmund has his big no moment, carries the body of Sinfjotli out, and wanders for a while till he comes to a fjord where there is a man on a ferry. The man is presumably old, one-eyed, dressed in gray with a staff, long beard, etc., white-brimmed hat. And the man says that he can take Sinfjotli and Sigmund across, but not at the same time. So Sigmund puts Sinfjotli's body onto the ferry, and the man disappears with Sinfjotli's body. Sinfjotli is apparently the only Norse hero who goes to Valhall without dying in battle. This may be because he is double the descendant of Volsung, and thus doubly the descendant of Odin, because remember, Siggy, Volsung's grandfather, was a son of Odin. We know that Sinfjotli is customarily held to be in Valhall because in the in Viking Age poems such as Eriksmal and Håkonarmal, which take place in Valhall, Sinfjotli is one of the people in Valhall who is speaking to Odin. Following the death of Sinfjotli, Sigmund banishes his wife Borghild and courts a young woman named Hjordis. Hjordis chooses between Sigmund and a king named Oilimi, and finally selects Sigmund. She is married to him, but Oilimi is insulted and leads a large army against Sigmund. As Sigmund gathers up his troops and goes out to battle against Oilimi, at the front of his troops, as he always did when he was younger, he's now getting a little bit old, and he fights as hard as ever. But in the middle of the battle, he sees riding toward him an old man dressed in gray with a wide-brimmed hat and one eye. I mean, we have some sense of this man's appearance now, who brings a spear down at Sigmund. As Sigmund swings his sword, the sword shatters on the spear shaft. Sigmund now sees the battle turn against him, and he is mortally wounded, but as a major protagonist, he does get some last words. So Hjördís is going over the battlefield afterward, and she finds the body of her husband Sigmund, who's still just clinging to life, and he tells her that Odin has that he fought while it was Odin's pleasure, but now Odin has taken away that gift that he once gave him. But he says that Hjördís is pregnant and that it's a boy, and that she should name him Sigurd, that he will be the greatest hero of all time, and that she should have his sword reforged for the benefit of their son Sigurd. And now Sigmund dies, and Hjördís will remarry to a powerful king named Ulf, and it will be in Ulf's kingdom that Sigurd, truly the greatest hero, or the most famous hero anyway, of the Norse sagas, will grow up. And I'll continue this story with the life of Sigurd in my next video. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.